For a people to be truly independent, they must have an independent educational system. If they are dependent on another people's educational system, they are dependent on another people's information. No other people feeds into another people that kind of information that gives that people the ability to dominate them. Therefore, I have often said, education has but one honorable purpose, one alone. Everything else is a waste of time. The role of education is to train the student to be a proper handler of power. In the African people's journey in the United States and away from home, that has been a forced journey into exile, they have had to depend mainly on other people's curricula, other people's concepts of education, other people's concepts of religion, and other people's images, including the image of God. The proliferation of independent educational institutions, independent approaches to culture and religion, harking back to our African beginning, looking back at the curtain behind slavery, began again on the eve of the Civil Rights Movement and continued through the Black Studies movement, and now through the Pan-African movement and the African nationalist movement. So a new educational institution is a continuation of this same move toward total independence for African people away from home. This kind of education means sacrifice, it means planning, it means careful budgeting. It also means that you must have in force an information apparatus to convince a larger number of people to support the institution and to assure its continuation. Africans living away from Africa and Africans living in Africa itself and in the Caribbean islands are in a battle to develop independent institutions, especially educational institutions that will reflect the world in their favor, as against the world in favor of the people who dominate them. This means new curriculum, new books, new teaching methodology, and it also means looking beyond the slavery curtain at what happened to African people before this catastrophe in history. Maybe we have put the wrong emphasis on slavery. We need to emphasize this event in history as one of the many things that has happened to us. We also need to study the fact that for 1,000 years before this event, we were bringing independent states into being, one after the others. We have been everything in the high drama of human life, from saint to buffoon. Slavery was only one of the many events that has occurred in our existence. And we need to look at this catastrophe and remember that this is a catastrophe that has touched every life of every people on the face of this earth sometime in its history. We need not brood over it forever or assume that it happened only to us. This kind of teaching can only be done in an institution that is free of outside dominance, where we control the curricula, the flow of information, the conduct of the students, and while we find the means of financing the independent institutions that teaches our students again that the only proper education is the education to handle power, that the world is ruled by those who prepare for it and who can handle power and authority with some kind of skill. We are in the enviable position of being able to claim all that is ours by right of God and man without taking anything that rightfully belongs to other people. I believe our mission for restructuring our lives, regaining what slavery and colonialism took away, will start with independent educational institutions designed by us, for us, and run in behalf of our children and generations to come after them.
Thank you so much.
As African people, we're very concerned about the education of our children. And I often attend conferences which are designed to deal with the educational issues that we must resolve if we are to appropriately educate our children. However, one of the things that I often find is that these conferences assume a definition of education. They often do not debate what education means to African people. And to appropriately talk about education, you must first begin with a discussion of what education means to us. We must understand that words have a political history, and the word education, as used under the present circumstances and as used by Europeans and others, is a word that has a political history that has a definite meaning for them. Blacks have been educated in this country since the very first days we arrived on these shores. We were perhaps among the first people in America to be given what may be called on-the-job training. We have received a special education from Europeans from the very beginning. The education that we receive today, no matter where and under what circumstances, as long as it is under European guidance and power, is special education. By that I mean education that is designed to serve the special needs of Europeans. And the needs that Europeans have for African people is a need for African servitude. So the education of African people, no matter how sophisticated, no matter where undertaken, whether in the public schools, in the private schools of America, in the institutions of higher education, Harvard or Yale or anywhere else, is an education for servitude. Too often we, as African Americans, assume that the purpose of education is to prepare ourselves for jobs. We do not ask, why is it that we are not being educated to create jobs for ourselves? We assume that those jobs will be offered to us by other people. So immediately our education is colored by a need to serve and by a presumption that we will always serve. Any education that operates on the presumption of servitude is an education that cannot function in the interest of our people. To appropriately talk about education, then, we must ask the question, education for what? We must recognize that the primary function of education is to advance the interest of a people. That education is not primarily for jobs. Education is for survival. For if we are educated for jobs, if we are educated to be computer engineers or accountants and so forth, and yet we cannot secure our survival as a people, then our education would have been for naught. Every culture engages in education, no matter how so-called primitive or how so-called advanced. When a young child is taught, let us say, to fish or hunt or to carry out the rituals of the group or to cook or to sew or to do any of the tasks of a society, it is being educated to maintain that society, to sustain that society and advance its interest. When we as African people in America then look at our situation today, we must ask ourselves, first and foremost, are we being educated to sustain our very biological survival? And are we being educated to liberate ourselves from the conditions in which we find ourselves? This is the function of an African-centered education, to secure the liberation of African people. A good education is not measured by the institutions that we attend, nor in terms of whether we are integrated with another people, nor in terms of whether we are receiving so-called equal funds, but in terms of the degree to which that education secures our survival as a people and solves our problems as a people. You begin an educational curriculum and you begin educational curriculum planning by first asking what are the problems our people must resolve. For we must be educated not to solve the problems of other people first, but to solve our own problems. And to do that, we must know what those problems are. Once we agree on what problems we must resolve as a people, and we must recognize that the problems that African people have to solve, the problems that our children must solve, the tasks that they must undertake in the future are not those of white children. Therefore, the education given to white children cannot be appropriate for African people. One of the primary problems our children must solve is the problem of our being oppressed. That is not the problem of white people. We must resolve the problem of feeding our people and enhancing their well-being, of building our capacity to survive and to defend our interests against incursions by other people. Once we ask the question then, what problems must we resolve as a people? We must ask the question, what kind of people must we develop to resolve those problems? And once we look at that issue, we must ask what kinds of institutions must be developed and what kinds of social relations must we build among ourselves so that we may solve the problems that confront us as a people. Then we must ask the question, what educational experiences must we undergo in order to become the people we need to be, to build the institutions we need to build in order to resolve the problems we must resolve? This is the basis upon which an appropriate educational curriculum is built. We must then look at the psychology of ourselves and the psychology of our children and design an educational experience which matches their developmental experiences and growth rates. We have demonstrated in our past works that the development of black children is not a duplicate of the development of white children. Our children grow at different rates and so forth. Therefore, an appropriate education must match their developmental rates with the kind of educational experiences they must undergo. This is in essence what an African-centered educational curriculum involves. The matching of the readiness of our children based on their development with the appropriate educational experiences necessary to build the kind of people we need to solve the kinds of problems we have to solve. The education of our children must be based on the psychology of African people, a psychology grounded in the history and experience of our people, not a psychology transferred from or borrowed from a people with a completely different history and experience, therefore a different psychology, and from a people who have a completely different intentionality, that intentionality being to maintain the domination and exploitation of African people. We must recognize that the experiences Africans have had under the domination of Europeans has been one that has shaped our psychology. And to a great extent then, the educational experiences that we must provide for our children must be one that reorients that psychology, but must confront that psychology in its reality and therefore appropriately educate our children in terms of it and in spite of it. An African-centered education then is an education that is based on an African-centered theory of learning. In what way do our children learn? How has their learning orientation been changed by the experience in America? In what way do we wish to change their approach to learning, and for what reason? Do you need then a theory of education that takes this into consideration? And once you look at the theory of education founded on the psychology of our people, founded on our intentionality as a people, you then must build a theory of pedagogy, that is a theory of teaching. How must our children be taught, given their psychological orientations, so that we can become the people we need to become, and ultimately a people who are a powerful people in the world, ultimately a people who will overthrow white domination, and a people who are in a position to not be dominated by any other ethnic group, and a people who can function independently in the world. If this is to be achieved, it is of primary importance that we have institutions that are directly under our control, that these institutions provide appropriate atmospheres so that appropriate learning can take place, that our children be put in an atmosphere where their minds will not be invaded by pernicious foreign influences. Therefore, it is imperative that African people build schools and educational institutions where the African message and the African future can be securely given to our children. And it is important then that we economically, spiritually, and culturally support those institutions which are designed and are being designed to provide an African-centered education for our children who are building an African-centered future for our people.
Thank you. I want you to hold 1 second because I want to change the background. Go on. A lot of times we say things like that we need an African-centered education in order to achieve liberation. But what I found that many young people don't understand what liberation is. They will say to me, "What do you mean by liberation?" Or freedom. But aren't we free? I mean, can't we go and do what we want to do? And what they don't understand liberation and freedom. So if you would explain it to us.
Okay. I would see the essence of liberation and freedom, of course, as self-determination. The ability to determine one's own destiny. When we say we are free as a people, under the current circumstances, we are free to the extent that other people determine that we are free. We are not operating under the influence of our own laws. We have not determined the nature of the government in which we operate. We are a dependent people. We must ask other people to secure our livelihoods, our jobs. We must follow their rules and their directions. This can in no way mean freedom and liberation when we must ask other people permission, and we must ask other people to provide us with special protections, to provide us with special laws, to pass special legislation in our interest, when we must plead in their courts so that we may socially interact with them, or when we are prohibited in various ways by the rulings of their courts, their legislatures, and so forth. We cannot count ourselves as free. We mistakenly also identify freedom with doing what we want to do. However, freedom is not doing what we want to do, particularly when our wants have been determined by another people. When we look at the TV sets, when we listen to our radios, when we read magazines and so forth, we see a whole host of media trying to determine our desires, telling us what we must buy, what we must wear, what we must eat, what to do here and what to do there. That means those people who control those media are literally then creating our desires. They're creating our wants and our needs. And consequently then, when we say freedom is doing what we want and what we need, when those wants and needs have been determined by another people, we are not really acting freely. We have been manipulated. We have been manipulated in the purchasing of material items and in the purchasing of resources and in the pursuit of certain pleasures and things that, when we really look at them, benefit only other people, because the other people own those resources. We should ask our question, why is it that everything we want is owned by somebody else? And why is it that whenever we get what we want, or strive for what we want, everyone else benefits materially, socially, politically, and culturally? And why is it the more we buy what we want, the more impoverished we become as a people? You measure freedom then in terms of the degree to which your so-called free activities benefit you as a person and as a people, socially, economically, politically, and otherwise. When your pursuit of your freedoms leads then to impoverishment, to joblessness, to injustice, to the other kind of things we talk about every day, you have a concrete measure then that what you call freedom is not freedom. When you have to depend on another people for your livelihood, when you have to ask their permission to move around in the world, when you have to get what you want from another people, then you're not talking about freedom. You're talking about servitude and slavery parading as freedom.
How might a free people, African people, how might their world look like, or their environment look like if they had real freedom?
I think the freedom of African people, of course, would be defined in terms of the traditions of African people. A people who highly valued a harmonious relationship with nature and with reality. A people who did not see themselves as enemies of nature. That means then there would be a people whose legacy will not be the pollution of nature, the destruction of nature and the destruction of the atmosphere. A people who work harmoniously with nature, and first and foremost, a people whose freedom, or so-called freedom, is not based on the unfreedom of other people. A people who operate not to exploit others, not to enslave others, not to degrade others, but to enhance others, to provide other people with the same kinds of privileges, the same kinds of respect that we ourselves would like to receive. We will be a people who will meet our very basic needs to be materially satisfied without being materially destructive. A people who recognize this, that man is fundamentally spiritual in nature, and therefore will feed the spiritual needs of mankind, will not see spirituality as an enemy to our economic, political, and social interests, but as central to our interests. We will provide an atmosphere so that human beings may develop their full potential, may develop their full character in positive ways, and be supported in that development rather than oppressed and distorted in their efforts to be human beings and to be full persons.
Thank you. Hold on 1 second. Now, I want to the nature of the mind. Can you give us an insight to the ability of the physical here and now to somehow be in contact with that which has gone before us, this mystery that we don't seem to understand, looking at what happened to that young girl in that slave gun?
We have to recognize that to a very great extent, our being shaped by another people has only been made possible by alienation as a people. And what I mean by that is, as I've often said, we cannot be the oppressive subjects of another people if we were truly an African people. You see, to be the psychological subordinates of another people means that we would have had to been alienated from our African selves, you see. It is only when you're alienated from yourself that a new identity, a new set of desires and orientations can be implanted in your psyche. In order for us to work for another people and to wish to identify with those people, particularly people who are our enemies and our exploiters, means that we would have had to have forgotten who we are as a people. Alienation implies then the separation from one's originality, a separation from one's original identity, and the acceptance of a newly created identity. We can only work for other people the way we do today because we have been separated from ourselves. A people who are at one with themselves can only work for themselves. In a sense, I've said that we have been alienated so that we may work for aliens, you see. To be alienated, when you get a people who can only spend their money in the interest of other aliens, it's because they have had an alien personality implanted in their psyches, you see. And that implantation can only occur when you have been separated, when we as a people have been separated from our African past. Therefore, it is crucial that we be reconnected to our past, that we become again one with ourselves. Now, that past has not been shut off from us. We have not been completely separated from it. It merely has been repressed in us. As long as we are black as people, as long as we are carrying our African characteristics, we have not been truly separated from our Africanness. When we talk about, for instance, as I often tell audiences, our color is not an accident. It is not a mere decoration that the Creator decided, as if he were painting Easter eggs, or she was painting Easter eggs, that she'd give one set of people color and another set this color and that color. Our color as a people reflects the history and experience of our people over hundreds and thousands of years. When we talk about our bodies as African people, our physiognomy as African people, we are talking about an historical phenomenon, you see. When we talk, and when we say that our genes, for instance, are responsible for determining our physical characteristics, and to a certain degree our psychological characteristics, we're not just talking about chemical packets that are contained in our cells. Our genes represent a capsulated history of African people. We carry the history of African people in our bodies. We are the endpoint of African history. Our children, in carrying the genes within their bodies, are carrying the totality of the history of African people. Therefore, we have a racial memory. That racial memory is implanted in our bodies and in our very souls. Therefore, it is due to the fact that we have not accepted that racial memory. When we refuse to accept our color and love our color, and refuse to accept our bodies, when we refuse to make the history that has made us, then we fall victim to alien influences. Often then we need certain types of props and experiences to reconnect us with our bodies, with our experiences, and with our histories, to bring from the unconscious into consciousness our history which has been suppressed by our experience as people. The kinds then, the things that, the kind of props, and by that I don't mean disrespect, but the kinds of objects and rituals that Elmina and other things represent is very important in catalyzing or stimulating the movement of repressed materials into consciousness. This is one of the reasons why then you see an overwhelming emotional reaction that takes place under those circumstances. I have often said that to be oppressed is to be ruled by emotions. You see, the reason why often many of us behave in terms of feelings and not merely in terms of logic is because when you're oppressed in terms of feeling. You're oppressed in terms of fear, in terms of anxiety, in terms of seeking to avoid pain and hurt, you see. And therefore, the avoidance of pain and hurt and displeasure becomes the chief motivational factors in your life. And consequently, feeling becomes the most important things in determining the way we behave, you see. We repress then those feelings which would motivate us to act in terms of our own interests. Because to be oppressed is to act against one's interest. You cannot be oppressed and act in terms of your own best interests, because the whole essence of oppression is to act in the interest of your oppressor. Therefore, those things which were motivating you prior to your oppression must be repressed, must be suppressed, must even be seen as alien, must be seen as an enemy to your existence. What happens then when one revisits historical sites, practices historical rituals, reconnects with the historical soil, is that the repressed memories and feelings are empowered, and they overcome the repressed mechanisms. They make a lie all of those things that we had before held as truth, and we become transformed, and we become at one again with ourselves. And that oneness with the self is extremely liberating and freeing and empowering and cleansing and healing. It releases the mind, it releases the intellect, and it releases us again to be free and to relate differently to ourselves and to the world. So it is very important, if we as people are to break the mental shackles that bind us today, that we ritualistically and otherwise reconnect ourselves to our history, for we ultimately are our history. And if we are to change our future, we must change our history, and we must use our history, because the future is but history renewed. And if we are to renew our history under our guidance, we must reconnect with that history. And we must use then those instruments that have been important in our transformation to be subordinated to others as means now to break that subordination and regain control of ourselves and our destiny again.
Thank you.